Good morning. Thank you very much, and my warm thanks to the Ministry for inviting me, and to all of you for joining on this wonderful opportunity to look at what are the opportunities for digital economy development in Thailand and throughout the Southeast Asia region. I'm from the World Bank's Digital Development Department, and I'm happy to say that in the last few years, there's been a huge increase in interest in this topic. And now we hear about emerging technologies, as was just mentioned, disruptive technologies. And every day the situation is changing. I just came from China, where even buying food in the street, it's almost impossible now to use cash. And I think here in Bangkok, probably that will be the same quite soon with PromptPay and others. So change is happening very, very fast. And I'll share with you a few slides from a report that the World Bank has been doing about digital economy development in Southeast Asia. But we're also looking at digital development trends all over the world. But this region is one of the fastest adopters of digital technologies. So the main theme of my talk today will really be on what is the enabling environment and what is it in particular that governments can do to help strengthen the foundations and the performance of the digital economy. And at the end, I'm very happy to take any questions that you or comments that you might have. So as I mentioned, the signs of very rapid digital adoption are everywhere in Southeast Asia. These are some pictures from Singapore and Malaysia, but certainly individuals now are spending a lot of time online. According to statistics, it's about 3.6 hours every day, which is ahead of the global average. And social media usage is particularly fast. So for e-commerce, the vast majority of customers are now getting information and doing transactions through social media. So this is the very good news. And as you can see from this graph, for example, Thailand is ahead of many other countries in the region in terms of doing e-commerce transactions through social media. And although it's difficult to measure, it's clear that this is a very significant trend. But the key question here is that the digital economy is more than just getting people online, getting people using Facebook or Twitter or WeChat or whatever. It's more than individuals. What's really important, and I think this is also really important for discussions on economic development today, is how to get governments and businesses more online and faster. So in the World Bank, we have developed what's called a digital adoption index, where we look at the uptake of digital technologies by individuals, by governments, by businesses. And a particular trend, actually, is that individuals, as we've seen, are moving fast to use smartphones and social media and so on. But there's still a lag in adoption, particularly by small and medium enterprises, for example. And so digital adoption by businesses is still lagging behind. And as you can see that certainly in Southeast Asia, there is more to be done to encourage businesses not only to adopt email and but actually to start integrating technologies much more into the business practices. And certainly for governments also, digital adoption varies quite significantly across this region. In Thailand, it's accelerating, but in other countries in the region, such as Philippines and Indonesia, not so much. On the trade side, digitally enabled services trade is growing also. And this graph also shows that Thailand is really one of the leading countries in the ASEAN region in terms of the growth of digital trade. And this is also some very encouraging news. So, as I mentioned, digital economy by businesses needs to accelerate, and I think it will be helpful to have a better understanding of where some of the constraints and bottlenecks are. I mean, as you can see in this graph, the Business Development Adoption Index, also in Thailand, is still lagging behind that of individuals and governments, and I think one of the things that we'll come back to at the end will also be, what are some of the ways to change that picture. So I apologize for the small size of this font, but this report that we are preparing now on digital economy in Southeast Asia will be published very soon on our website, and we'll be happy to arrange for dissemination of that through the ministry. So what are some of the key enabling factors for helping to grow the digital economy in Southeast Asia? And the number one factor is, of course, cheap, reliable internet access. And here, Thailand is, again, making very significant advances compared to many of the other ASEAN countries in this region in terms of digital connectivity. And this is also seen in national policies and strategies. But without fast and cheap internet available to all, including in more remote and rural areas, it will be very difficult to see realize the benefits of digital economy development. Payments. This is another very critical platform, and one where there's now a lot of evolution and rapid change. So, with the development of new financial technologies, with fintechs, with the diversification of payment systems, reliable and trusted payment systems are also very critical for the development of the digital economy. Digital skills. This is really one of the more challenging areas, and we'll discuss this in more detail later in the presentation. But digital skills, with the changing nature of the workforce, it's really become necessary for many countries to think again about how to maintain or enhance the skill level of the workforce, both the people coming into the workforce, but also people already in jobs, to adapt to these changing technologies. Logistics is, of course, critically important for e-commerce. And then there's the overall policy environment, which we'll discuss later, which looks also at the legal and regulatory framework for digital economy, which is the basis for trust in electronic transactions. And in most of the countries in this region, there is already some form of electronic transactions law. But where there is a need for more focus is really on, for example, streamlining, enabling the flow of data across countries, because cross-border data flows are really such a critical part of digital economies today. And the trust and security of data for consumers is also very, very important. So while many countries have some frameworks around this, it's really important to strengthen this data protection and data management framework. So coming back now to each of these policy areas, I'll look at these in some more detail, and these are described in more detail in the report that we're preparing. So on connectivity, as we can see that the mobile broadband, so smartphone-based internet access, is really developing very fast. And the key indicator for that is really the extent of 4G access, which in Thailand is actually Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore have the highest levels of 4G access in the region now, and 5G, of course, coming soon. And this is important not only for individual use of internet, but as our colleague mentioned earlier, for IoT, for Internet of Things, for smart cities. 4G, 5G will be very critical to allow that sort of real-time management of data. But a big gap is, for many countries, is on the fixed broadband side. Access to fiber to the premises. Optical fiber is really very critical for large data transmission for financial institutions and so on. So enabling environment for broadband is a really critical part of digital economy development. And as we've seen from Thailand, Thailand has some very ambitious targets, which, if achieved, will really position Thailand very strongly for the next wave of digital opportunity. And the key issue for governments here is to allow competition along the value chain of broadband, everything from fiber to the building to fiber to the home. And this is where policy measures around spectrum management and infrastructure sharing are very important, because infrastructure sharing greatly reduces the cost of deploying broadband infrastructure in countries. So now looking in more depth at this issue of skills, it's an issue that there's often a lot of comments on from the private sector. We recently had a workshop, for example, in Indonesia, where we worked with the government, and we invited also representatives from private companies, from the Indonesian firm Gojek, for example, which is like Grab, a very large transport and other service provider. And even in a country as large as Indonesia, there was a still significant shortage of skills. People had to be brought in from India to do specialized programming and so on. So the skills gap is really quite a concern, and it would be interesting to hear from you what is your experience here. So the skills challenge is everything from the sort of foundational and basic digital skills to the more technical skills. And right now, the very hot skills areas are really in areas such as AI, data analytics, where there's significant shortages. But where is the sort of role or concern for government in this? And our analysis really focuses on two areas. One is on the need for a lot of consultation between government and private sector on skills development, skills partnership. And the other is on lifelong learning. And an interesting example there is from your neighboring country, for example, the small country of Singapore, which has set up an entire program called Digital Skills Future, where every Singaporean gets access to financial support to rebuild their skills. And it's a program that's still ongoing and will need some evaluation, but it's a very deliberate attempt by the government to address this problem. On digital payments, now this is a very critical enabler for digital economy development, and here there's a lot of change. There's a lot of movement, and also here in Thailand, we understand that there's quite a bit of work going on by the financial sector community to really accelerate the adoption of fintech and other digital payments. So if you look at the data that we have from across the region, the means of payments for online purchases is still to a large extent, cash-based, and more dramatically in countries like Vietnam. In Thailand, actually, cash is sort of on the way down. But there's clearly a need to extend and accelerate the use of digital payments. And one way to do that will be, and I'll discuss that a little bit more later, through the upgrade of the identity system, which will extend and deepen the trust in digital payments. So another role for government in this area is also on issues such as interoperability of payment systems. Logistics is again a very critical enabler for digital economy development, and there are also many ways in which, of course, digital technologies themselves can expand logistics. But one thing that we have done in the World Bank is also develop a logistics performance index with other partners, and it shows a gradual improvement, and actually Malaysia, Thailand and Singapore are at the top of the rankings for logistics performance at the moment. But there are certainly challenges, particularly on some of the cross-border issues, and this is a concern also for Thailand and the government. So I think some of the messages that come out of this report and work that we've done and are really, again, around deepening these policy enablers and the policy framework for digital economy development to help seize the opportunity, which is a big opportunity right now. So the first one is that the digital divide, so the access to fast, cheap internet, it's still there, and it needs to be a high priority for governments to help with the private sector close that gap for rural areas, for remote areas, and that would have a significant impact on other parts of the e-commerce value chain. And government does have a role in not in creating lots of new regulations and barriers, but in really focusing on some of the enabling regulations and programs for digital development. I haven't mentioned entrepreneurship. There are various programs out there, and one lesson from those is the need to really evaluate what works and what doesn't work. But the key area that our research shows that governments are advised to focus on is really on some of the cross-cutting issues such as data protection, data privacy, and so on. And so that really leads us to some questions about how to enhance the opportunities for Thailand, and how to create opportunities for digital adoption by businesses, and how to stimulate new investment. And here I think this dialogue between the government and the private sector is really critically important. One of the areas that we may engage on is potentially on looking at research, on doing some more research on digital adoption in some of the key sectors of the economy in Thailand, whether it's tourism, cars, other manufacturing, adoption of Internet of Things, to really understand in depth where some of these bottlenecks are. And we're looking at potentially developing a digital transformation monitor for Thailand to show where is the growth in the digital economy, where are the gaps, is there a need to look at across regions of the country. And then the digital ID that I briefly mentioned earlier is, Thailand has had an ID program for more than 30 years, a very successful one. And now there's some consideration about how to expand that, to use that really as a very robust means of authentication for a whole range of transactions. And then there's also the question of really interoperability of these systems in the ASEAN context. So it's a big topic. There's a lot of policy challenges facing governments today on where to prioritize. But I hope that I've set out some of the areas where we find that there are opportunities for further development in Thailand, and we're very happy to collaborate on this program. So thank you very much, and if there are any questions or comments, be happy to discuss with our colleagues from the ministry. Thank you.